During Muratov's time at Novaya Gazeta, 6 of his journalists were murdered, most notably Anna Politkovskaya.
Now, the 20th and 21st century makes ancient Rome look both modest and quaint. I mean, while bread for too many is in short supply, the circuses are everywhere and constant, 24 hours a day and in the palm of our hands. Weapons of mass distraction everywhere.
Hello, my name is Stanley Heller. Welcome to The Struggle. Nobel Peace Prize co-winner Dmitry Muratov spoke at Southern Connecticut State University in early September. Muratov is editor of Novaya Gazeta, New Gazette. He was a newspaper correspondent during the First Chechen War. In 1995, he became head of the editorial board. The Nobel Committee specifically commended Novaya Gazeta's critical articles on subjects ranging from corruption, police violence, unlawful arrests, electoral fraud, and troll factories. This year, the paper was shut down by Putin inside of Russia, but it was reborn as Novaya Gazeta Europe. During Muratov's time at Novaya Gazeta, 6 of his journalists were murdered, most notably Anna Politkovskaya. I was able to take a few photos during the event. Muratov was a close friend of Mikhail Gorbachev, who was the last head of the Soviet Union, who died just this month. He said he knew him for 32 years. He displayed 2 photos, one a professional one, and another that Muratov took of Gorbachev at his famous birthmark. Muratov sold his Nobel Peace Prize for $103 million and gave it all to UNICEF to help Ukrainian refugees and others. Muratov painted a grim picture of Russia, with all anti-war dissent crushed, a propaganda machine that tries to paint Putin as a god. In the very brief Q&A after the program, he was asked, "Do you have hope?" In answer, he quoted a colleague, "I will not humiliate myself with hope." That same weekend saw New Haven revive its folk festival and GreenExpo. Promoting Enduring Peace had a booth advancing its ideas about taking over the fossil fuel industry and its short-run project of getting Connecticut's governor to ban gas-powered equipment on state land. What's the alternative? People asked. Well, we could cut parts of the imperial war budget and give out free electric-powered equipment. And we could let things grow wild. Take a look at Pakistan and understand what it means, climate emergency. So tell us about the New Haven Climathon.
Sure. New Haven Climathon is an event that's going to be held October 29th at Martinez School in Fairhaven from 1 o'clock to 5:30. And our group is interested in raising awareness about the local impacts of climathon, of the climate change, about having engagements with people from all our communities, and then catalyzing action. And you know, we're in New Haven around here, we're on the seacoast, so rising seas, hurricanes, floods are going to be a bigger and bigger problem. Rising temperatures, of course, is a problem. Increased food prices because other places are affected by droughts and things like that. We also will have droughts undoubtedly here. Questions about our water supply. So these are all very important issues. They're not something way off in the future. They're starting now, and we have to do something about them now. So please join us at the Climathon.
And what kind of activities will there be?
Well, there are going to be a bunch of presentations by experts about all those issues I raised: rising seas, flooding, health impacts of climate, immigration, and then we're going to have these workshops that take on those issues, and everybody gets in and tries to figure out what can we do, what's the solution to this. So you can find us. The organization's name is actually much longer. It's Reimagining New Haven in the Era of Climate Change.org. That's our website.
An update on a prisoner situation from the town of Bil'in in the West Bank, written by the father, Iyad Burnat. September 15th. Yesterday, the Zionist occupation court sentenced my son, Abdel to administrative detention for 6 months, after he was arrested a week ago from our home. Note that Abdel spent 1.5 years in prison, as well as 60 days in the Al-Mascubaya prison, and was released a short time ago with a fine of 8,000 shekels. That's over $2,000. My son, Mohammed Iyad Burnat, 17 months in prison so far without trial. Ismail Abu Rama, their maternal cousin, 17 months in prison so far without trial. Isa Hamid, their maternal cousin, was sentenced to 18 months and a fine of 3,000 shekels. Jalal Hassan Khatib was sentenced to 18 months and a 3,000 shekel fine as well. For Mohammed Burnat, the administrative detention sentences was renewed for the second time. Mohammed Yassin, 15 months in prison so far without trial. On our website, one of the archives is about the Sabra Shatila massacre. It took place on September 16th through the 18th in Beirut, Lebanon, 40 years ago. Last week, Justine McCabe spoke about it at the Palestinian Museum in Woodbridge, Connecticut. Here's a portion of her remarks.
I'm Justine McCabe. I was working in Lebanon as an anthropologist and left at the end of that year in 1975 when Sabra and Shatila refugee camps, however pitiable, were still intact. That changed horrifically in September 1982 with the massacre. 30 years ago today, on September 16, 2012, an historically accurate account of events was published in a New York Times op-ed by Seth Anziska, now a professor of Jewish-Muslim relations at University College London. His account, A Preventable Massacre, reflected Israeli and U.S. archival information that had recently been released about the Sabra and Shatila massacre. Briefly, these were the events. On the night of September 16, 1982, the Israeli military allowed a right-wing Lebanese militia to enter into 2 Palestinian refugee camps in Beirut. In the ensuing 3-day rampage, the militia linked to the Maronite Christian Phalange Party raped, killed, and dismembered at least 800, some say as many as 3,000 civilians, while Israeli flares illuminated camps. Narrow and darkened alleyways. Nearly all the dead were women, children, and elderly men.
10 years ago, we marched with banners and drums near Yale in downtown New Haven. On Sunday the 18th, we'll remark about the massacre during the rally in Middletown, Connecticut at 2 p.m. Details at thestruggle.org. Going back to Dmitry Muratov, one of the things he talked about was the imprisoned WNBA basketball star Brittany Griner. Muratov said that at her arrest for carrying a minuscule amount of a marijuana substance, the arrest documents had been typed up in advance, and that a video of the search of her bag inside of customs went out on YouTube immediately, something unheard of. He said the whole arrest was a government operation. Speaking of sports, we're going to hear from a terrific sports writer, David Zirin, as he spoke at the Socialism 2022 conference in Chicago.
So Dave Zirin writes about sports for the nation. He's the author of 12 books about the politics of sports. His latest is The Kaepernick Effect, Taking a Knee, Changing the World. He's going to speak to us today on the topic of playing through fire, sports in a time of reaction. Over to Dave.
Thank you. There you go. How many people consider yourselves like a casual sports fan? You follow it, but it ain't that big a deal. And how many of you would rather shave your head with a cheese grater than hear somebody talk about sports for 40 minutes? Anyone there? Oh, wonderful. Oh, what's your name? What is it? Pat. Cat. Well, I really hope this talk hits its mark for the diehard sports fan, the casual sports fan, and CAD. That's our goal for this session. If we can do that, we're gonna get everything done perfectly. So here we are at the Socialism Conference, so obviously let's talk some sports. You know, it was, it was C.L.R. James, the great Trinidadian Marxist and revolutionary. He wrote a brilliant book about cricket. I know nothing about cricket. I love this book. It's called Beyond a Boundary. And in its opening, he penned the following statement. He wrote, "What do they know of cricket who only cricket know?" And it's a beautiful line. What do they know of cricket who only cricket know? And to use less elegant language, what James is saying is that you need to have some sense of the real world if you're going to understand the sports world, and perhaps you need to understand the sports world to have a view and lens to understand the real world. So in the tradition of C.L.R. James, we're not going to talk about sports until we talk about some context. And you know, this is a conference, as you probably have figured out, where there are a lot of people with a lot of differing political views about the state of the world right now. So I guess we're starting with mine, representing only myself. I believe that we're living in a time of great crisis, great opportunity for the left, great global struggle, but primarily, I would argue, we're living in a time of profound reaction and the growth of the authoritarian right. In this country, we've got the Supreme Court from hell, which has grabbed the steering wheel of this country and turned it hard to the right, and I would argue has it headed straight off a cliff. The crushing of abortion rights, the deification of the gun, the elimination of free and fair elections, and the smashing of the wall between church and state. I think it's left the majority of this country kind of reeling about what to do, and also a lot of people on the left reeling about what to do, and questioning about how do you function when, you know, fascists, some of whom are intimately connected or in the Republican Party, are on the march. A couple hundred marched yesterday in Indianapolis. I mean, this is like nothing I've seen in my lifetime, the degree of confidence from the far right and the way it's connected to one of our ruling parties, and we need to really reckon with that. I mean, when even Joe Biden calls this iteration of the GOP semi-fascist, then you know that we're in a moment. And I'm sorry, I got to stop my talk. I mean, What the hell, Joe? What's a semi-fascist? I'm sorry. I mean, that to me is like saying my dog semi-barked. It's like it either barks or it doesn't. No such thing as a semi-fascist. I mean, so these are troubled times that raise a ton of questions about how to organize, but they also raise questions, at least in my neck of the woods, about what's the ethical role of the athlete in a period such as this. How do you just play while the world burns? How do you, in effect, play through fire? And it's a critical question, not only because sports has proven itself to be an important site of resistance over the last decade, but also because sporting spectacle will undoubtedly be used to distract a populace away from the reality of a society sliding into autocracy and environmental decay. But this is nothing new, and maybe that's the first thing to say to give us a sense of confidence, is that sports has been a feature of autocratic societies, of course, since the days of ancient Rome, when the satirical poet Juventus wrote of a society drunk on what he called panem et circenses. People know what that means? Bread and circuses, that's right. And what a gift those all-consuming obsessions were to the corrupt political class that could operate in shadows while the world cheered, eyes firmly in the other direction. Now, the 20th and 21st century makes ancient Rome look both modest and quaint. I mean, while bread for too many is in short supply, the circuses are everywhere and constant, 24 hours a day and in the palm of our hands. Weapons of mass distraction everywhere. But the most popular and pernicious circuses are the mega events, particularly the Olympics and the World Cup, that have been used by murderous autocracies repeatedly to smash dissent at home and project a shiny, happy face abroad. Now, the most infamous example of this historically is the 1936 Olympics in Hitler's Berlin, which was basically staged as a 2-week commercial for the Nazi Party. And if people have more questions about anything that I raise, please raise them in the discussion, because I'm going to be doing shorthand for a lot of this history. But I don't know if folks knew this, but you know, most of the pomp and circumstance that we associate with the Olympics, like the running of the torch, for example, or when countries march in country by country into the main Olympic stadium, you know, stuff that's a staple of NBC's coverage, that comes from the mind of Joseph Goebbels, the 1930s propaganda leader and 40s propaganda leader of Nazi Germany. And it was thought of and conceived for the 1936 Olympics. But it's not just the Olympics that create these scenarios. I mean, the most famous boxing match in the 20th century was probably the Rumble in the Jungle between Muhammad Ali and George Foreman, which was in a country then known as Zaire, now the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Zaire was run by a bloody dictator and a CIA asset named Mobutu Sese Seko, who used this boxing match as a distraction to torture and kill dissidents to consolidate power. Or we could look at the 1978 World Cup in Argentina, where just a few streets away from the main stadium, the military junta's torture center was going at full tilt, killing a generation of resistance fighters while the world looked in the other direction. And it's not like this has only been revealed in later years, what happened in Argentina. I mean, back then, groups like Amnesty International, they held protests in front of embassies that included slogans like, yes to football, no, yes to football, no to torture. But the media ignored it, and by June 1978, the military was at its strongest, and it had, thanks to FIFA, the world governing soccer body, a World Cup to thank. Now, I'm talking a lot about other countries, but make no mistake, the United States through the last century has taken this practice of using sports propaganda to obscure reality, and they have honed it to a fine art. I mean, when Jesse Owens, who was a black man, won 4 gold medals at Hitler's 1936 Olympics, you had newspapers in the United States crowing about this, saying, this proves we're not a racist society. In 1936, Jesse Owens' victories prove we're not a racist society, unlike Nazi Germany, which believes in a master race. I mean, these are Washington Post, New York Times columns. Like, we are not racist because of Jesse Owens. And this, of course, demanded willful ignorance of the ravages of Jim Crow, white terrorism, not to mention ignorance of the fact that Nazi ideology had been developed by studying the United States. You know, and if you get to read the book, Hitler's American Model, the United States and the Making of Nazi Race Law, that one is an absolute eye-opener. And the media did the same thing when Jackie Robinson debuted in 1947. I mean, Jackie's heroics on the field meant that the sins of racism were receding in the past. You know, this is before the civil rights movement. They're saying in 1947, there's no more racism. The first time, at least according to my own research, that I see the words post-racial have to do with Jackie Robinson in the late 1940s, not some imaginary Obama presidency or whatever. Like, this was about using sports to cover up the crimes of racism, which Jackie Robinson knew all too well, which is why after his playing career, he became a barnstorming speaker for civil rights. And actually, it's kind of interesting, he was the #1 most requested speaker by southern branches of the NAACP. The #2 most requested speaker was someone you might have heard of named Martin Luther King. And I always thought that was funny. Like, you imagine people in an organizing meeting being like, all right, can we get Jackie Robinson? No. All right, we'll get Dr. King. Oh my God, I can't believe we got to get Dr. King here. Jackie's busy. What are you going to do? And his big line at the end of these speeches was, if I had to choose between the Baseball Hall of Fame and full citizenship for my people, I would choose full citizenship time and again, which is right on. And by the way, back then, in the movement, when people used the word citizenship, it's not the way it's used today as a way to oftentimes divide people from the global south, from the United States, and who's undocumented and all that. Citizenship was used as a way to say, you must recognize our humanity. So that was a powerful thing to say, I want full citizenship for all my people. Now, today, this use of sports as a sort of propagandistic fig leaf is done so often, it has its own name that you might be familiar with, sports washing. How many people are familiar with that term? I've heard it before, sports washing. 2022 in the mainstream media has in fact been called the year of sports washing. So for the media, seeing 2022 in such a matter in the world of sports, it's actually a very neat and tidy narrative, because 2022 has been chock full of sports washing. Here's how the argument goes. Sports can be understood by looking at 3 countries, basically, in 2022. China, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar. Autocracies, all of them. And China, of course, hosted the Winter Olympics while disappearing their own athletes in January for speaking out of turn. Tennis star Peng Shuai took to social media to speak about her sexual assault. She was disappeared for doing so. And I hope no one here calls me a running dog for pointing this out. I was criticized greatly for criticizing China online about their hosting the Olympics. What are you, pro-Olympics? I don't get those politics at all. Then you have Saudi Arabia, which launched the Live Golf Tour. People have heard of that, playing golfers like Phil Mickelson 9 figures to abandon the Professional Golfers Association in order to basically sports wash the bloody hands of the House of Saud. And a quick word on the Live Tour. I don't want to shock anybody here, but golfers are not the most political bunch when you look at the athlete world out there. And Mickelson was pressed by the mainstream media about, like, how can you go with this Live Tour? What are you doing? And I want to read you what he said, because it says so much. He said, Saudis are scary motherfuckers to get involved with. We know they killed the journalist Jamal Khashoggi and have a horrible record on human rights. They execute people over there for being gay. Knowing all of this, why would I even consider it? Because this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to reshape the PGA Tour. Now, Phil Mickelson then apologized after this quote went public, but he didn't apologize to Saudi Arabia's victims. He apologized to the Saudi royal family. And this is all a huge deal for Saudi Arabia because, they have this perspective about the 2030s where they're going to host both the World Cup and the Olympics as part of their Vision 2030 plan to project itself into the world. And lastly, we have Qatar. In a few months, Qatar will be hosting the World Cup, which is expected to bring an avalanche of positive coverage to a petro-dictatorship run by the Al Thani family, even though quite literally thousands of migrant workers, many of them from one of the poorest countries on earth, Bangladesh, have died being brought in to work construction. They've died on the job, thousands of workers, since they were awarded the World Cup. Dozens of them died actually building World Cup facilities under horrific conditions. And so we're going to be watching a World Cup, basically, talk about playing through fire. It's going to be playing on blood. And if we're not saying that loudly during the World Cup, we're doing a disservice to all the workers who died. Now, These sports spectacles, these circuses, are in fact political events aimed at cleansing regimes that by all moral right should be shunned. But as comfortable as it is to point out China, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar, which the mainstream media is doing, we have to see that sports washing is not just the province of autocrats. It is also common in the United States, not just historically, as mentioned, but right now. Preparations for the 2028 Los Angeles Olympics are going on, and unhoused people are being herded up, either imprisoned or driven outside the city, having their personal possessions thrown away, all for the purposes of building more stadiums in Los Angeles and building more infrastructure for the Olympics. And this is just corporate welfare. This is a feeding frenzy that the poorest in Los Angeles are going to suffer for. And lastly, a country that's always left out of the sports washing conversation is Israel, which regularly takes part in what they call sports diplomacy as they tour their athletes around the world, particularly using basketball, which I find particularly offensive because basketball is awesome. But they use it to project an image of the country at odds with the reality of Palestinian apartheid. So sports washing is real, and it's everywhere. It has an internal function to quash dissent at home and an external function to project a scrubbed image abroad. But as we descend deeper into this age of reaction that we're living in, with sports brandished as kind of a crude, blunt tool against truth and political clarity, what is the ethical role of the athlete, if any? One thing, first and foremost, we need to understand is that athletes can play a critical role in times of resistance, and history is, of course, rich with examples of this. We could talk about Muhammad Ali, Billie Jean King, Tommy Smith, John Carlos, Wyoming Attias, the great soccer star Socrates, who in 1982 stood up to the Brazilian dictatorship. But that can feel like ancient history. Sometimes you talk about 1968, people think you're talking about 1868. So we need to talk about more recent examples of the way athletes have functioned under autocratic circumstances. And I want to look at the Arab Spring over a decade ago as people rose up against autocratic political leaders and brutal monarchs. When this took place, prominent athletes, you didn't get this on ESPN, but prominent athletes took to the streets as orators, fighters, and even medics.
That's our program for today. See you next week at this time. I'm Stanley Heller for The Struggle.